Andrea and Amy sit in a canoe on the quarry lake fishing. Amy holds an umbrella to protect herself from the sun. A discussion starts over the type of fishing knot their father used. They realize that their father taught them different fishing knots based on Andrea's need to catch the fish and Amy's need to throw them back. Both women are on the verge of tears before Andrea reminds Amy of their father's rule, no crying on the boat, as it scares the fish. Amy wonders if their father is alive, as she believes Florida wasn't hit that bad by the apocalypse. Andrea tells her not to worry about it. Nearby, on top of his RV, Dale is keeping watch. He looks through his binoculars and, in a field above the campsite, he sees Jim furiously digging holes into the ground with a shovel. On the rooftop in Atlanta, an enraged Daryl Dixon has just discovered his brother Merle's severed hand on the ground. He angrily points his crossbow at T-Dog, who doesn't show any fear. Daryl eventually relents when Rick pulls his revolver out and aims it at him, telling him that he doesn't care if every walker in the city hears him shoot it. Daryl puts his crossbow down and asks T-Dog for a durag, in which he proceeds to fold up Merle's hand and place it in Glenn's backpack, while T-Dog is grabbing the hacksaw and the numerous other tools from Dale's toolkit. On the rooftop, Daryl follows the trail of Merle's blood along the rooftop. Back at the campsite, Dale approaches Jim in the fields, who refuses to respond as he digs what appear to be graves. Dale's concern mounts quickly when Jim won't take a drink of water, despite the intense summer heat. Amy and Andrea, meanwhile, present the group with their lines of fish. Morales thanks the women, expressing gratitude that his children will have food to eat. Carl asks them if they could teach him how to fish like that, and Lori says she wouldn't argue with that, impressed by the women's efforts. Dale interrupts the excitement to express concern over Jim, and points him out still furiously digging graves on the hilltop in the fields. Daryl shoots another walker with his crossbow and notes that his brother managed to kill 2 walkers. In the room one-handed, the trail of blood leads Daryl, Rick, Glenn, and T-Dog to a kitchen, where a blowtorch is burning next to an iron stake weight crusted with skin, the result, they speculate, of Merle cauterizing his stump. They believe Merle has left the building. Rick agrees to help Daryl search the streets for his brother. At camp, Shane and the others approach Jim, who still won't explain why he's digging. Lori tells Jim he's scaring Sophia and Carl, and Shane orders Jim to take a break. He swings his shovel at Shane, who tackles him. Subdued, Jim cries over the death of his wife and 2 sons, revealing the only reason why he survived was because the walkers were too busy eating his family. In an abandoned office above the department store in Atlanta, Glenn outlines a plan to retrieve Rick's bag of guns on an old whiteboard. Daryl will watch his back from the store's alley, while Rick and T-Dog cover a second alley that is 2 blocks away. Glenn and Daryl climb down the ladder to the alley, and Glenn drops his backpack while Daryl stays behind to cover him. On the street, Glenn runs towards the tank. Walkers are waking up all around him, but he grabs the bag and Rick's hat without much trouble and heads back toward Daryl. In the alley, a teenager, Miguel, sneaks up on Daryl from behind. Daryl quickly turns and trains his crossbow on the teen, interrogating him about his brother Murrah and telling him to be quiet. Miguel yells for help despite Daryl's warnings. Rick and T-Dog, hearing Miguel's screams, head for the alley. Daryl is jumped by 2 men, Jorge and Felipe, who have also come for the guns, with which Glenn has just arrived to the alley. He turns to run the other way, but the men grab him and start beating him. They take the bag of guns. Daryl fires an arrow into Felipe's hindquarters, causing him to drop the bag while yelling in pain. Felipe and Jorge instead grab Glenn, throw him in a getaway car while fighting off walkers, and drive off, leaving Miguel and the guns behind. Daryl shuts the gate in the alley to keep out the walkers before turning on the teenager. Rick and T-Dog arrive just in time to pull Daryl off Miguel, as Daryl explains that his friends took Glenn. Taking Miguel with them, Rick grabs the bag of guns and his hat, and they head back up the ladder to the roof. At camp, Shane has tied Jim to a tree and is offering him water. Unlike earlier when Dale offered him a drink, this time, Jim accepts it. Lori and Carol are doing schoolwork at a table nearby with Carl and Sophia. Shane tells Jim he's going to keep him tied to the tree until he no longer thinks Jim's a danger to himself or others. Jim apologizes for scaring the children, and Lori forgives him on account of sunstroke. Dale asks why he was digging holes, but Jim cannot remember. He dreamt something is going to happen, and it has forced him to dig holes. Jim warns Lori not to let Carl out of her sight. Back inside the abandoned office building, Rick's looking for answers while a confused T-Dog wonders what they've gotten themselves into. Daryl's still seething over Glenn's kidnapping and getting jumped by Miguel's men. Daryl threatens Miguel by throwing Merle's severed hand in his lap, telling him that's what happened to the last guy who crossed him. Miguel cowers and Rick throws Daryl off him. He just wants to know where to find Glenn, and he manages to convince Miguel to take them to him. Miguel leads Rick, Daryl, and T-Dog to an abandoned factory, where the leader of the group, Guillermo, emerges. Rick proposes trading Miguel for Glenn, but has no interest in giving up his bag of guns, with T-Dog aiming a scoped rifle at his head from a nearby rooftop. Guillermo demands the bag of guns, threatening to kill Glenn if they don't hand it over. They shove Glenn on the edge of a rooftop, his mouth covered with tape and his hands tied behind his back. Rick and the group retreat to a nearby foreman's office, where Daryl argues that the guns are more valuable than Glenn, but Rick insists he owes more than that to him. Rick knows how dangerous the mission could be, that he might get killed when he goes back to the factory, and tells Daryl and T-Dog to head back to the campsite. They refuse to let him go alone and also take note that they wouldn't know what to tell his family, so they had to load their guns and grab Miguel. Rick escorts him into the warehouse carrying the guns on his back. Rick cuts Miguel loose and demands Guillermo hand over Glenn. Guillermo tells Rick that he's going to chop up Glenn and feed him to his 3 vicious man-eating dogs. Before the situation can escalate further, an old woman wearing a nightgown, Abuela, shuffles into the middle of the standoff, asking Philippe for help with Mr. Gilbert. She notices Rick's uniform and begs him not to take Philippe away, saying he's turned his life around and they need him here. Rick tells the old woman that Philippe is helping him find a missing person. Abuela assumes he's referring to Glenn and takes him by the hand. Abuela leads Rick into a nursing home auditorium, where several elderly people are grouped around an asthmatic man. Glenn is trying to console the man. Philippe helps the man with an inhaler. Guillermo's 3 vicious dogs are teacup-sized chihuahuas, and they yap at the group as the survivors realize what's really going on. Rick pulls Guillermo aside and confronts Guillermo, stating he was ready to kill everyone in the building for the guns. Guillermo explains he was only trying to protect the food and medicine for the residents. As the staff abandoned the patients, leaving Guillermo and Philippe, the only staff members behind, people trickled in to check on their grandparents, and suddenly he's the leader of a group of young men, women, and the elderly. The group agree to leave some of the guns to Guillermo so he can defend the nursing home. They then leave the nursing home and head back to camp. Back at the camp, the group is preparing for a fish cookout, and Morales proudly shows off the upgraded campfire with higher rocks to hide higher flames. Carl walks to the tree with Shane, who frees Jim and invites him to the fish fry. Ed, his face bruised and swollen, broods in his tent, declining Carol's invite to join the group for the fish fry. He grabs Sophia's arms and tells her to stay with him, but Carol says forcefully that Sophia is joining in with the fish fry, leaving Ed to angrily curse them as they leave. As the group sit around the campfire after dark, Morales asks Dale why he still wins his wristwatch every day. Jackie agrees that it's pointless, ever since the world ended. Dale tells a story that it is important to keep track of time. Amy heads to the RV to use the bathroom. Ed, meanwhile, hears rustling outside his tent. He thinks it's Carol bugging him to join the group and unzips the flap to yell at her, but instead, he finds a walker. It attacks him, biting his neck as more walkers swarm inside the tent, devouring him. Amy emerges from the RV, complaining that they're out of toilet paper, as a walker approaches from behind the door and bites her arm. Amy screams, and Andrea turns to see her sister being attacked, and she looks on in horror as the camp is sent into a panic. Walkers attack from all directions, grabbing and devouring people all over the campsite. Shane orders Lori to get Carla and everyone else into the RV as he fires his shotgun. Amy screams in pain as a large chunk of her neck is bit by the same walker who bit her arm. Andrea runs for Amy as Jim and Morales beat down walkers with baseball bats. Rick and the others, running toward camp, hear gunshots in the distance and quicken their pace. While back at the RV, Amy is dying from blood loss. Rick, Glenn, Daryl, and T-Dog arrive and quickly shoot the remaining walkers. The survivors begin to catch their breath as Carl runs tearfully into Rick's arms, and Lori looks on, terrified. Andrea, cradling a dying Amy, tries her best to comfort Amy. She eventually dies of blood loss, leaving Andrea to scream in anguish. Dead bodies litter the camp, and as the group recollect themselves, Jim states he remembers why he dug the holes to bury the bodies.